Good morning, and welcome to Inquirer Live, Worldview with Trudy Rubin. I'm Trudy Rubin, Foreign Affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and this morning I'm delighted to be joined by H.R. McMaster, the Fuad and Michelle Ajmi Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. General McMaster served as the 26th National Security Advisor at the White House under former President Trump in 2017-18. He retired in 2018 as a Lieutenant General after 34 years in the U.S. Army, having commanded soldiers and organizations in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and held key posts in designing the future Army. He's the author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, which has just come out in paperback. I only have the hardback edition. And the award-winning Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. Today, I'll be discussing General McMaster, the lessons to be learned from the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan, including the chaotic withdrawal, and how this affects America's role in the world going forward, including our policy towards Russia and our intense conversation with China. Just a few housekeeping details before we get started, so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the question, you can submit questions for General McMaster. To do so, please type the questions in the comment feature on your screen. If you're watching on social media, please go to inquirer.com/Trudy Rubin Live, one word, and type your questions. We'll address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce General McMaster.
Hey, Trudy, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Great to see you again, and hope you're going to come to visit Philadelphia again sometime soon. General McMaster, I know that you have been very involved both as a military man and as a strategist in the issue of Afghanistan. So first of all, I want to ask you, do you consider it a defeat?
Absolutely. It's a defeat. And what's so sad about it, Trudy, it's a self-defeat. We defeated ourselves in Afghanistan.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we didn't sustain the will necessary to have a sustained effort in support of the Afghan government and Afghan security forces. You know, by 2017, really 2018, we had a very low level of troops there. And a much decreased level of financial support that was enabling the Afghans to bear the brunt of the fight against the enemies of all civilized people on a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. And we abandoned that effort because we talked ourselves into defeat. I think we were frustrated in many ways because of the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars. But Trudy, I attribute that mainly to the short-term approach we took to what was always going to be a long-term problem in Afghanistan. And that short-term approach actually lengthened the war, made it more costly, and I think led to the dissipation of Americans' will, right? And of course, we also set some unrealistic expectations. You know, Afghanistan was never going to be Denmark. It didn't need to be Denmark, though. It just needed to be in Afghanistan with a government in place that was hostile to jihadist terrorists and security forces in place that were strong enough to cope with the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which was really lies across the border at the time, in Pakistan. So I think we talked ourselves into defeat with this mantra of ending endless wars, and really betrayed this thinking that betrayed the conceit, right? That wars end when one party disengages. And I think what we're seeing now with the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe, one is really just beginning, as well as the political catastrophe that you alluded to, the loss of really trust and credibility in America, based on the precipitous withdrawal and the fact, Trudy, if we were just going to leave Afghanistan, why the heck didn't we just leave? Why did we actually strengthen the Taliban on our way out and deliver all these psychological blows to the Afghan government and security forces that set conditions for their collapse?
Let me interrupt you for a minute because I'd like to pick apart some of the things you've said and focus on them individually. Many critics have said that we trained the wrong army in Afghanistan. We trained an army that looked like ours. And I remember when I was watching training of Afghan soldiers outside of Kabul, they were being trained on M16s and they were complaining that it was too hard to keep them clean. And AK-47s, Russian guns, which they'd had before, were much simpler to use. Was one of the problems that we trained the wrong army?
Yeah, I think that's a valid criticism to a certain extent, but I don't think it really had to do with the equipment as much as it had to do with maybe not enough focus on leadership, and leadership that was committed to strengthening those armed forces. What happened, Trudy, is we relied on Mujahideen era militias to do the bulk of the fighting when we attacked the Taliban government and Al Qaeda in 2001. It was an extremely successful campaign enabled by our intelligence officers and our special forces and American air power. But what happened is, without really a greater U.S. military presence on the ground, these Mujahideen militias rolled into Kabul, and they've actually effected state capture over critical state institutions and functions from the ground up. And then these groups morphed into criminalized patronage networks that were engaged in building up a power base in advance of a post-U.S. Afghanistan. Now, why were they worried about a post-U.S. Afghanistan? Because we kept telling them we're leaving. We said, "Hey, we're leaving," and what these groups feared was a return of the Civil War from '92 to '96. And so what happened is, these groups that were in charge of these institutions were stakeholders in the weakness of those institutions, because that weakness of that institution gave them impunity and essentially the ability to steal, from the state and to divert our assistance. And so the motive was criminal, certainly, but the motive was also political, because they feared a return of the Civil War, and each of these groups wanted to be in a position of advantage relative to other groups.
Well, all right. So you had immense corruption in the Afghan government, not just among these Mujahideen leftovers from the war against the Soviets, but also even from civilians who had spent a lot of time in the United States, like Hamid Karzai, the former president, and Ashraf Ghani, the one who fled and left his troops and people behind at the end. Why couldn't we do anything about that? You yourself were the head of a task force on fighting corruption, and yet people like yourself who were working on this issue, my understanding is the work you did was never implemented. So we knew there was corruption that was eating at the fabric of the society. Why did we pretend that this wasn't a potentially fatal problem?
Well, but one of the reasons, Trudy, is we were always leaving, right? So I commanded this task force, formed this task force, and commanded it from 2010 to 2014. That was too late, right? What we had already done is dumped a whole lot of money into the Afghan economy and into the Afghan government, well beyond the absorptive capacity. And so we gave these organizations the ability, right, to divert that assistance and to strengthen those organizations further. But the fundamental dynamic, Trudy, and I would say certainly in the Karzai government, I wouldn't lump Ghani and Karzai together, right? But I think that with Karzai, he looked over his shoulder. Remember when Secretary Rumsfeld said in 2003, right, everybody remembers the Mission Accomplished banner with President Bush on the aircraft carrier. That very same day, Secretary Rumsfeld was in Afghanistan saying that war was over. And then when you go fast forward to the 2006 election, where Karzai was attempting to be reelected, he looked over his shoulder. Hey, who's got my back? Nobody. And he cut deals again with these Mujahideen era elites. And essentially what he did is he gave them license to steal from the state with impunity in exchange for their political fealty. And it was from that point on that the political settlement in Afghanistan became almost wholly reliant on unchecked criminality. And that's what our task force was organized to try to reverse. This is how we diagnosed the problem. And what we recognized is, hey, this was a problem not of technical assistance. This is how, USAID approached the problem, is we just need to teach, Afghan officials about how not to be corrupt. Well, hey, that's not the issue. The issue is political will, generating the will to take on the problem of corruption and organized crime. And I think we set a realistic objective for us. We said we want to work with Afghans and the international community broadly and international assistance groups to reduce the threat of corruption and organized crime such that it is no longer fatal to the Afghan state. And of course, we put a dent in it, but we didn't put enough of a dent in it. There were some significant reforms, as you know, in the Ministry of Defense. Those reforms probably were too little, too late. The Ministry of Interior remained a big problem to the very end. But in other areas, such as borders and airports, there was some progress and then increased state revenue as a result. So we actually went sector by sector, prioritized these. When I had my monthly meeting with Hamid Karzai and laid it out for him, we worked with Afghans on this, tried to generate the will. But you know what? In Washington, nobody wanted to hear it, Trudy. They were just getting out, right? Remember in 2000.
Yeah, I was working with Hamid Karzai's brother, who was a crook and an opium dealer. So we were.
And what we said is, hey, we need to make our assistance conditional, right? I mean, we know the approach that if you don't reform, we'll give you twice as much money doesn't work, right? So how about making our assistance conditional? And that sounds like a pretty logical thing to do, doesn't it? But it was an uphill battle with these White House officials who now are saying, well, we just never really figured Afghanistan out. And I just want to say, really? Is that what you're saying? I think that's farcical, because what they were trying to do was just keep it on the back burner, right? They didn't even want to acknowledge there was a war going on. Remember when President Obama announced the reinforced security effort in 2010, he announced our withdrawal timeline at the same time. December 2009, I think it was. At the same time, he announced our withdrawal. And so how does that make sense? Because what that did is tell the Taliban, hey, just wait these guys out. They're leaving anyway. But what did it tell the Afghans? It told the Afghans, hey, you better get as much milk out of the international cow as you can as it wanders across the Afghan plain for the last time, right? And build up your power base. Not to put it crudely, but I mean, that's what happened. And so what happened is we actually did have a 2-decade-long war in Afghanistan, but it wasn't a 2-decade-long war. It was a 1-year war fought 20 times over with inconsistent and fundamentally flawed strategies.
Given that, General McMaster, what good would it have done to keep 2,500 or 3,000 U.S. troops?
Or 10,000, right? I mean, who cares what the number is, really? What's really important is what they're doing. And what they were doing was enabling the Afghans to bear the brunt of the fight, and they were preventing what you see happening now. I think we should have thought of it as an insurance premium to prevent the collapse of Afghanistan and the lost war. Because one of our objectives going in, Trudy, people talk about it like we could have just taken the George Costanza approach to Afghanistan and left on a high note, in 2001. But there's never been a war that we fought that didn't require the consolidation of gains to get to a sustainable, usually political outcome, consistent with what brought us into that war to begin with. And this is what we didn't realize from the beginning and didn't organize our efforts to achieve. And so one of the objectives was to prevent Afghanistan from ever again becoming a haven for jihadist terrorists who want to commit mass murder against us. And that's what we failed. That's what we failed to do. But that's what our relatively small troop commitment was enabling. And it wasn't pretty, right? I mean, a lot of Afghan districts and rural districts were under the control of the Taliban, and much of the country was contested. Okay, so yeah, Afghanistan was a violent place. But what you're seeing now is the reversal of all the gains made since 2001. and the failure to achieve that critical objective. We know, it's not a theoretical case, Trudy, right? It's not a theoretical case that these jihadist terrorists become orders of magnitude more dangerous once they control territory and populations and resources. That's what led to 9/11. That's also what led, after the rise of ISIS in Iraq, to the rise of the most destructive terrorist organization in history. Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0 became ISIS. And they conducted 195 attacks internationally.
Sorry to interrupt, but so let me then ask you, when you think of 2,500 or 3,500 troops remaining, you're not thinking of this as aiming for total defeat of the Taliban. You're thinking of this as maintaining a status quo in which jihadist terrorists would not be able to take over the country.
So exactly. So there are four key tasks that I think a strategy on Afghanistan and on South Asia, and a strategy against jihadist terrorists in South Asia should be based, right? Task one, work with Afghan leaders to help forge an accommodation between various groups, an accommodation based on a common vision for the country. We didn't do that, Trudy. You know what we did? We closed all of our consulates around the country. People say, oh, we've militarized our policy. We need more diplomacy. That's a bunch of bull, because we didn't do it enough diplomatically in Afghanistan. We withdrew after the Benghazi attacks. We closed our consulate in Herat, in Jalalabad, in Mazar, and in Kandahar, and we withdrew into a Kabul bubble. So what did we do instead diplomatically? We sat across the table from those jackasses in Qatar, who were the shop window for a terrorist organization, and supplicated to them, and made concession after concession to them. The second key task is Afghanistan had to be hardened, strengthened against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban. This is institutional reform, as I was mentioning, like was occurring within the Ministry of Defense, like was occurring with these very capable special operations forces, but of course was reliant on our intelligence support, on our air support. But that's okay, right? I mean, that was the Afghan forces' differential advantage. The Taliban's differential advantage is their unscrupulousness, their willingness to commit mass murder against innocents. But we gave up our differential advantage. The Taliban kept theirs, though. And when people kept saying, well, hey, there's no military solution in Afghanistan. Hey, the Taliban came up with one, didn't they? The third key aspect of this is we needed other countries to play a more productive role, or at least a less destructive role. And of course, at the top of this list is Pakistan. And what we should have done is confronted Pakistan and say, okay, you can't have it both ways anymore. We're cutting off all of our assistance. You're going to be an economically and diplomatically isolated pariah state with a single state-sponsored China. And you know what that looks like to me? That looks like North Korea. That's your future. How do you like that? That should have been our policy toward Pakistan. And then the fourth element of an effective approach to Afghanistan was sustained international commitment. And you know what, Trudy? We had that. We had a big coalition. There were more NATO soldiers in Afghanistan than there were U.S. soldiers in the last couple of years of the war. And so, was it sustainable? I think, heck yes, it was. We defeated ourselves. And as I mentioned, we delivered all of these psychological blows to the Afghans that weakened them on our way out. And actually, this is what's so crazy, Trudy. We actually partnered with the Taliban against the Afghan government. That's how I see this. We became advocates, for Hibatullah Akhundzada. And we kept complaining about, Ashraf Ghani, God, he's not really that very, very good. He hasn't taken on corruption and so forth. Do you prefer Hibatullah Akhundzada? Do you prefer a man who encouraged his 17-year-old son to be a suicide bomber? Because that's who's in charge now. And we actually set conditions for that.
You were saying that we partnered with the Taliban. You're talking about the negotiations that took place under the Trump administration. Now, you had left as National Security Advisor by the time that happened, correct? What did you tell President Trump, and what impact did those negotiations have on the final result?
Well, I mean, hey, this is a story that I think should be told, Trudy. Remember President Trump during the campaign, he said, he basically said we need to get out of Afghanistan immediately, right? That was his campaign sort of mantra about Afghanistan. But once I got to the White House unexpectedly, at the end of February of 2017, I made this my priority because I believed at the time that the war had actually become unethical. We were muddling through in the war. Our soldiers were sailors, airmen, Marines were taking risks and making sacrifices. And what the hell for? What was the objective? What was the vision? What was the strategy that would deliver an outcome worthy of the costs and risks and sacrifices? So I went to South Asia in April. And I met a lot of resistance in that. The Secretary of State didn't want me to go. Secretary of Defense didn't want me to go because what they wanted to do was kind of control the information getting to Donald Trump because they feared that he would just engage in a capricious withdrawal like we see now, ending in disaster. But what we did is we began a process of presenting the president with best analysis, best advice, and multiple options. And in August of 2017, we brought him 3 options for Afghanistan, really 2 fully developed options at Camp David, right away from all distractions. And you know what the first one we briefed was? Complete withdrawal. And do you know what picture we painted? What's going on in Afghanistan right now and what the ramifications are. And what decision did Trump make? He said, hey, this looks bad. I don't want to do this. And he developed I think for the first time, we had in place a strategy in Afghanistan that was reasoned, sustainable, prioritized our interests, and would have resulted in the most favorable outcome and prevented what we see happening right now. And if you go back to the speech he made in August 2017, it's a compelling argument. Now, of course, you already mentioned he abandoned that. He abandoned that because I think the neo-isolationist wing of the Republican Party in particular, I don't know what you call these people. Are they economic nationalists? Is it the alt-right? I'm not sure what they are. But this is, the Rand Paul position on this, or the Koch Foundation, end the endless wars perspective on it. But, of course, the news flash coming out of Afghanistan is the same news flash that should have come out of Iraq in 2014 when ISIS took over the territory the size of Britain. Hey, wars don't end when one party disengages. Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, they'll look around and say, oh, hey, the Americans are gone. I guess we'll just stop. They're fighting an endless jihad against us, and so I think he made the right decision in 2017. I don't know the story about why he reversed course and sent Zal Khalilzad over for the capitulation negotiations. We ought to call it what it is. He made concession after concession. He did not include the Afghan government in this process. So think about the psychological blow to the Afghans from that. What did the Taliban do with that? They said, hey, Afghan government, hey, Afghan officials across, do you think the Americans really have your back? They don't give a damn about you. They just want to get the hell out. So you better start accommodating with us right now. That was the message that was being delivered to them in 2018, 2019, and into 2020. And then the first concession was, oh, okay, it's okay without a ceasefire. What did the Taliban do during the negotiations? They intensified a massive assassination campaign, killing judges and journalists and government officials, gunning them down in front of their children, many of them. They committed mass murder attacks on maternity hospitals, on girls' schools. That was what was happening during the negotiations. What did we do? Oh, we made another concession. We forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth, who immediately went back to fighting with the Taliban, who by this time are now marshaling outside of the big cities and provincial capitals in the north, and to a certain extent, Helmand province as well. And we're not even targeting them. We're not targeting them anymore. We backed off, right? And we're helping them. And the ISI, the intelligence arm of the Pakistan Army, the Inter-Services Intelligence, this is an ISI planned and largely led operation that we just watched, and we didn't do a damn thing about that. And so we made concession after concession. And this is what you got. And then what we had envisioned, right? We had envisioned this coalition government that was going to have, Mullah Baradar, Hibatullah Akhundzada as part of it.
These were so-called moderates.
Yeah. Oh, it's ridiculous. This is the astonishing self-delusion, right? We actually conjured up in Afghanistan the enemy we would have preferred to fight and stopped fighting the actual enemy. The assumptions that we made were, the delusion, the aspects of this delusion were that the Taliban would share power. Really? I mean, Siraj Haqqani's in charge of security now in Afghanistan.
Terrorist list.
One of the most, I think, the number one terrorist in the world who deserves to die, I believe, is the head of security in Afghanistan. That's the person we partnered with. They used the word partner for security of Kabul airport during the evacuation. And then we're surprised, when there's a mass murder attack that kills 13 of our servicemen and women.
So
I would tell you, I believe the chances of that not being coordinated with the Haqqani network, which has run the Kabul attack network for over a decade, is zero. Zero. This was an effort to humiliate us even further on our way out, and was done, I think, with the complete knowledge of the Taliban and certainly the Haqqani network. So these groups, this was the assumption, Trudy, these groups are like, there's a bold line. The State Department spokesman said that. Oh, these are separate organizations. Talk about self-delusion. They're completely integrated. Siraj Haqqani is a major al-Qaeda figure and is the military commander of the Taliban. Remember, Trudy, the images of all these kitted out, fighters taking over the Kabul airport, these terrorists? That was Bajra 313. That's an al-Qaeda brigade that was trained by the Haqqanis, equipped by the Pakistani ISI with Gulf state donations out of Gulf states, and then fought for the Taliban for years.
So let me just interrupt for 1 second to summarize and ask you a question to which I'd like a brief answer, which is, from everything you've said, you have a situation where we started negotiations that were basically a surrender. We rejected the concept of an insurance policy long-term that you believe could have sustained a fight to keep a takeover by jihadis of the country. So the question is, if we had kept a small presence, given that Pakistan is playing this nefarious role, giving a haven to Taliban leadership, to the Haqqani network, which is close to al-Qaeda and is now in the new Taliban government, given Pakistan's role, given the corruption that was flourishing before the in the government that we were backing, you believe that this small number still could have held the line, even with this undertow of corruption in Pakistan?
Yes. If we had an integrated effort across all of our departments and agencies, it's not just the numbers of troops. It's not just the support for the Afghan security forces. It's the diplomatic effort. Right. It's the development assistance that makes our aid conditional, our international aid conditional on the reforms necessary. It's actually just being serious people and putting into place a strategy to achieve our objectives. What we have seen, Trudy, is an astonishing degree of incompetence. If you think about it, everything that we did actually cut against one another. So, how does it work when you begin negotiations with your enemy after you give them the timeline for your withdrawal, right? I think in war, somebody came up with the saying, Karl von Clausewitz, right? The 19th century philosopher of war. He said, war is an extension of politics. We did not integrate what we were trying to achieve politically in our associated diplomatic efforts with what we were doing militarily. Actually, we were doing exactly the opposite. The Obama administration did the same thing. The Obama administration deluded themselves into thinking Pakistan will be a partner. And so we really just need to focus on Pakistan, not worry about Afghanistan as much, and not target the Taliban, because they defined the Taliban as not the problem. They listened to Taliban apologists like Barney Rubin, who told him, the Taliban, they're kind of just this rural movement. We heard a senior British general just say this recently. They're just like this rural movement. Really? It's not just a rural movement. It was formed and trained and prepared for this offensive in Pakistan by the ISI, with funding that came largely from the Gulf states, with support by Iran as well as Russia. This wasn't just some sort of movement that emerged.
I'm going to get to questions now in 1 second, but if you could just briefly answer this. Many critics of staying inside Afghanistan with a small number argue that global jihadi terrorism is no longer our biggest enemy, that we have to focus on China and Russia and possibly North Korea, maybe Iran, and that terrorism is fragmented and we don't need to focus on it in Afghanistan. Has the threat in your mind of jihadi terrorism gone way down the enemy list, the danger to America, or not? And if you could keep it brief, because I want to get to questions.
Okay, jihadist terrorists are more dangerous today than they were on September 10th, 2001. And the reason we're not seeing more attacks like 9/11 is because we've become better at defensive capabilities. But now that we are disengaging, because we know that the Biden administration has not been conducting active operations in support of our counterterrorism partners internationally, has not been striking nodes in jihadist terrorist networks who want to kill our children. Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, for example, the AQIS, these other groups that are associated with one another and who share resources and personnel and expertise. I'll tell you, on jihadist terrorism, Trudy, we try too hard to disconnect the dots sometimes. What's particularly dangerous about now Afghanistan being controlled by jihadist terrorists is there is a terrorist ecosystem there that contains 20 U.S. designated terrorist organizations. What makes them more dangerous? They're orders of magnitude larger than they were on September 10th, 2001. They're more mobile. Where did the ISIS alumni go after we took away their safe haven? Most of them went to Europe. And not most of them, a lot of them went to Europe. And a lot of them went to countries that we don't require visas for travel to the United States. They're more mobile. They have access to more destructive technologies and encrypted communications, and they're trying to get a hold of some of the most destructive weapons on Earth. These are all reasons, I think, to remain engaged against them. We know from September 11th that threats to our security that develop abroad can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. And so I think what makes these groups dangerous is everything I've mentioned, plus this mantra of ending endless wars and the movement in Congress to end the authorization of military force that allows our special operations forces in particular to enable others to bear the brunt of the fight against these enemies of all civilized people.
I'm going to turn to questions, and we may come back to some of these issues. I have a couple of questions here about the aftermath for the people of Afghanistan. One is, are we still making any effort to get out those who are at risk? For example, the women judges that sentence Taliban criminals, U.S. aid workers, journalists, translators, etc. And many, if not most of whom, were left behind.
Yeah, so a lot of people use the analogy of the humiliating, withdrawal from Saigon during the North Vietnamese offensive in 1975. Yeah, I think this is more like the crisis in Tehran in 1979. We left the Taliban, in control of not only hundreds of U.S. citizens. I believe the number that the State Department is using is way lower than it actually is. Lots of U.S. residents, but then citizens of our allies. As well as the person who asked the question mentioned, those who had worked with us and who are particularly vulnerable and in a dangerous position. So this is an ongoing hostage crisis. I think what we're doing now, I hope it's not what we're doing, but I suspect that we're sort of paying ransom to get anybody out, right? If you look at Secretary Blinken's speech that he gave when he talked about how the Taliban are going to help us get people out of Mazar, when there have been some flights out of Mazar, he in the same breath almost said he wanted to release $78 million or something like that to them immediately. So what we have done is we have given the Taliban the ability to extort us and to have really a protracted hostage crisis that they can use to their own benefit. That's what happens when you surrender to jihadist terrorists.
We also have a question about what happens to the women and girls of Afghanistan now. Can we influence their survival in any way at this point?
I'm sad. I don't think so. I really don't think so. You hear, when you listen to the Secretary of State and others, I think that they are just completely delusional about this. The idea, that opprobrium, from the international community, chiding tweets or critical speeches in New York and Washington or The Hague or Brussels is going to make a damn bit of difference to these people. So I think what we're going to see is them try to thrust Afghanistan back to the 7th century. We're already seeing it happening, and you're just going to see more of it. I mean, these people have not changed, in my view, and will not change.
What is the impact that the hasty exit under the Biden administration will have on the geopolitics of the region there, and on the way that China, Russia, and even our NATO allies regard us?
Yeah. Well, what we have done is we've left, an area that really gave us, I think, a good bit of influence across South Asia, vis-a-vis Pakistan, but also in India. I mean, in vis-a-vis Iran, and in Central Asia. And what you'll see is, when a vacuum occurs, that vacuum will be filled. It'll be filled by the Chinese, who are very, already very active and using the One Belt, One Road initiative to create servile relationships with countries in the region, so they can create really exclusionary areas of primacy, not just across the Indo-Pacific region, but really on the fringe of the Eurasian landmass. The effect of that is going to strengthen the relationship with Pakistan, who already is in a servile position to China based on its complete economic dependence on China and on donations from the Gulf states. And I think it isolates India in a way that makes the situation extremely dangerous. Russia has been giving weapons to the Taliban, I think funding the Taliban, as has Iran. And Iran will move into that vacuum, as well as Russia. What I fear the most, Trudy, is that this crisis, though, will empower jihadist terrorists in a way that could lead to the collapse of control in even more territory in Pakistan, a country that is nuclear armed. And I think it is not unrealistic to imagine, that these jihadist terrorists could gain access to the most destructive weapons on earth. If the Pakistani state army comes under duress, the way they often deal with that is to precipitate a crisis with India, and I think there could be all of these second and third order effects that could lead to almost the unimaginable, right? The exchange of nuclear weapons in South Asia between India and Pakistan. So, I think that what we have done is we've disengaged, again, because I think so many Americans on both sides of the political spectrum view our disengagement from complex challenges abroad as an unmitigated good, right? Because you have the narrative of, $1 trillion in 20 years, and it seems just like a waste. But that's based on the premise, that the situation just can't get worse after we disengage. But I think, as we saw with the complete withdrawal in Iraq in December 2011, remember, Vice President Biden called up President Obama from Baghdad in December 2011 and said, "Thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war." Well, again, wars don't end when one side disengages. And I think we're going to see the same dynamic play out, sadly. And we've demonstrated our inability to learn from some of our even most proximate experiences.
You've spoken of your critique of the Trump administration's final moves on Afghanistan. I have a question about President Biden's strategy. Do you think how do you think this defines the Biden administration's willingness to use force in the future? In his UN speech, he spoke about a new era of relentless diplomacy.
Yeah.
Can this substitute for using force abroad?
No, it can't. And especially when you're dealing with jihadist terrorists. And I just think the administration, sadly, I want them to succeed, right? I mean, all Americans should want them to succeed, but they have demonstrated really no limit to their hypocrisy. I mean, in the same speech in which the president really made clear his intention to surrender to jihadist terrorists by adhering to the timeline, he mentioned how women's rights and human rights were foundational to his approach. Remember, this is an administration who said, "Hey, we're going to have much better relationships, with our allies," and the old days of Trump and the offensive tweets, to our European allies is over. Well, hey, compare offensive tweets with leaving their citizens behind in a ready-made hostage situation. So I think there's a real crisis of trust and credibility that is going to take a long, long time to overcome. And in terms of this new era of diplomacy, when Secretary Blinken said, well, our experience in Afghanistan is beginning a new diplomatic era, does he really think that you can accomplish your goals or an outcome with the Taliban through diplomacy only? And I'm reminding Trudy of a quotation from Secretary George Shultz, who was honored and remembered in a beautiful memorial service yesterday in San Francisco. He said that negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the bargaining table. And I think what we have forgotten is that really strategic competence is the ability to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to accomplish well-defined and well-understood objectives. And we have had a complete disconnect between what we do militarily and what we try to achieve politically and diplomatically. And so I think that for us to restore our credibility, the first step is to regain a degree of competence in foreign policy and certainly in war.
Speaking of competence, there's a question about fighting terrorism after leaving Afghanistan. Is it possible to do this, as President Biden says, by over-the-horizon means? And I would add to that, we have seen the cost in civilian casualties, both most recently with the misstrike that killed 10 people. That was over the horizon. But even before, when we had people on the ground who could call in strikes, often those strikes got caught up in local politics and the wrong people could be targeted. So firstly, the question about over the horizon, is that possible? And secondly,
okay. It's possible, but it's not effective, for all the reasons you've stated. And what's really important to note is that really our technical intelligence collection capability through surveillance and communications intelligence and so forth is degraded massively by not having access to an airbase close by, right? The other thing is, in this capitulation agreement to the Taliban, I think we're ceding them, maybe rights over their airspace. Are we going to actually just fly into Afghan airspace with impunity? I mean, I think we should, but will we do that, or are we going to now recognize Afghan airspace under the control of the Taliban? And then finally, if you can't augment technical intelligence collection capabilities with human intelligence, you run the risk, as you said, Trudy, of really missing targets, certainly, because remember, jihadist terrorists are all trying to avoid being classified as a target. And when they move into dense urban areas, they're intermingled with civilian populations. And without human intelligence, it's impossible. It's really an impossible intelligence problem. So, I think it's a pipe dream, this over the horizon. It sounds good. I mean, it seems to me like we're all just about bumper stickers now. End endless the wars, over the horizon. Okay, but once you actually try to look at what they're saying in detail, it's astonishing because of its lack of logic and really the disconnect between these mantras and phrases between them and reality.
One last question, General McMaster. If you were rewriting dereliction of duty for Afghanistan, who would you criticize for the result, as you criticize the top brass in your book about Vietnam, the top brass for lying, the lesser officer corps for not telling truth to power? Who would you blame for dereliction of duty in Afghanistan?
Well, I'd have a lot of criticism to go across 4 administrations now. And first, I should say this was a just war, right? This was a war in response to the mass murder of nearly 3,000 innocents that occurred on September 11, 2001, the most destructive terrorist attack in history. It was absolutely right. to unseat the Taliban, to decimate Al Qaeda. But what the Bush administration can be rightly criticized for is to thinking it could be easy, and to not recognizing that the consolidation of gains to get to sustainable outcomes is an integral part of war, right? And this was the Rumsfeld light footprint approach, announcing we're leaving. Okay, now we're really leaving. And then the Obama administration doubled down on the flaws in the war, by reinforcing the security effort kind of half-heartedly, but then announcing the timeline at the same time, really engaging in delusional thinking about Pakistan, saying Al Qaeda is a shadow of its former self, right? And then I think the Trump administration got it right, but then also deserves a lot of the blame, right, for the capitulation negotiations. Guess who else said Al Qaeda is a shadow of his former self? Mike Pompeo, right? So this is, it's not often you get a quotation from President Obama and Mike Pompeo that match each other, but they match each other because of this strategic narcissism, right? The definition of this war only in relation to us, and then assuming what we would prefer to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And then, oddly, the Trump administration doubled down on the flaws of the Obama administration, and then the Biden administration doubled down on the flaws of the Trump administration. So I think there's a lot of dereliction of duty to go around, and I think maybe one of the themes would be that I think it is unethical to wage war without a determination to win. And I think winning in Afghanistan, it should have been defined as ensuring that Afghanistan never again became a haven for jihadist terrorists. Now we have essentially helped turn it over to jihadist terrorists. And, we came up with a whole new bunch of euphemisms during this war, like, a responsible end to the war. Well, in war, because each side tries to outdo the other, if you're not there to win, you're at a significant disadvantage. Can you imagine going into a boxing match and saying, hey, I'm really just about the responsible end here. I'm not really trying to win this match. You're going to get your ass kicked, and so it's counterproductive, but it's also unethical, because I think what Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, teach us is that having a just end in mind is an essential criterion for it being a just war. And I think we lost sight of that too often and weren't committed to it. And our leaders in Washington should be fighting the war as hard as our servicemen and women are who are in battle. And the way that they can contribute to the fight is through a higher level of competence and integrating what we're doing from a diplomatic and political perspective with what we're doing from a military perspective. Our leaders across 4 administrations failed to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to exercise my privilege and just ask you one last thing off of what you just said. You talk about a just war. As you know, there were many civilian casualties in rural areas during these 20 years. And there's been some very moving articles written about, for example, the difference of women in the cities who had all kinds of new rights under the last 20 years to study and to learn, and women in rural areas who were often caught, whether or not they could go to school, but who were often caught in the crossfire and in attacks by the U.S. aimed at terrorists, but innocent villagers got caught up. Do you think if we had stayed, we could have had a more just war when it came to Afghans?
Yeah, hey, the jus in bello theory calls for proportionality and discrimination, right? But when you have a terrorist enemy that is intermingled with civilian populations, it makes it kind of tough. Some of these articles you're mentioning, like the one in the Washington Post recently, and then there was one in the New Yorker, I think they're astonishing because of the degree to which they actually seem to celebrate the Taliban. I think that this is just an indicator of how some members of our press have become Taliban apologists. Essentially, what they're doing is celebrating the victory of a terrorist organization that is now eliminating all women's rights. After that terrorist organization was the main cause of violence in the country. So I've seen these articles, and it's actually astonishing to me that the sort of the left in the United States is celebrating the Taliban's victory as a victory for somehow like women's rights and security. I mean, it's an astonishing reversal of morality, Trudy.
Well, I totally agree about the Taliban's immorality. I did read the New Yorker piece, and I think the characterization is unfair. I think people are afraid of the Taliban, which
absolutely. Look at the people she interviewed. The people she interviewed, who said, "Well, my husband went out, with his rifle at night, and he was going to go, I guess get a quart of milk or something." I mean, I don't buy it. It looked like just transparent Taliban propaganda to me.
Well, what I was going to say is I think that the author made clear that there was, on the one hand, fear of the Taliban, on the other hand, fear of getting caught in the crossfire. But I thank you. I think it was a terrific discussion. There's so much more that I could ask. And I want to add that my next Trudy Live, or Inquirer Live with Worldview by Trudy Rubin, will be with somebody who worked for you, General McMaster. Fiona Hill has a new memoir, and I will be talking with her about it on November 19th. So please join me in November, and I want to thank both our audience and General McMaster. Bye for now.
Thanks, Trudy. And I hope the Eagles start playing football soon.